Hey, welcome to Live from America podcast. This is Hatem. Noam is not here today. I don't know what's up with him. He can't do 4 o'clocks anymore, so I have to switch. We filmed this 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so I can't do it. We have to switch it. But he'll be back next episode, hopefully. But I have a very good friend of mine, amazing guest. Always love to have him from time to time. It's a great conversation, always. He is Michel Paradis. He's a leading human rights lawyer and national security law scholar, expert in international law, and author of two books that I believe they're going to be an amazing movies one day. Um, The Light of the Battle and The Last Mission to Tokyo. And he's here.
I am. It's great to see you again, man.
Great to see you. Well, today we filmed this on, I don't know, day even. It's Thursday, and a new pope was just selected. And
From Chicago.
yeah, the very first American pope. So
First American. Yeah.
So we're making religion great again. See?
That's although I think I don't know if President Trump will take as much credit once he
Oh,
knows
oh,
this current Pope's position on things like migration and economic inequality, but we'll find out.
but he's still gonna say like, "Hey, I gotta help him got selected and elected and all that." But the one thing I was like so looking forward to, and then I was kind of like bummed. I mean, I'm not Catholic, so I don't really know a lot about religion, but I was so excited because I thought I was like, finally, I'm gonna hear the speeches in English, and then his speech.
Yeah, disappointed there, weren't
Yeah,
you?
did you know that?
I didn't know if he would do it in Italian. That is very much tradition. Obviously, technically, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome in Roman Catholic sort of like theology and canon law. So it's not a position that is like you're the head of the church by virtue of being the Bishop of Rome, but that is the actual position you've been given.
Oh,
So I guess Italian is just tradition. Uh,
I guess, and he speaks pretty good Italian, I guess. All right, so we'll
he
see.
does. He does. He's apparently fluent in Spanish and Italian.
Oh, nice.
He lived in Peru for over 2 decades and is actually
Yeah,
a Peruvian citizen.
but that's amazing. We have the very first American Pope. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So you were in Guantanamo Bay. I don't know how much you can talk about it, but
Yeah.
what was going on over there? What were you doing there? I mean,
We were just
if somebody know that I was there, they know exactly why I'm there. But
yeah.
you,
Right. I don't look like I belong there, at least depending on that what part of it. No, so yeah, I was down in Guantanamo. Primarily just there are still about a dozen detainees who are being held there. Most of them are in various stages of these military commission tribunals. And some of them are charged in capital crimes. And I was down primarily because occasionally it's good to talk to them about various issues. I don't go that often, but I when I do, I try to meet with some of the detainees whose cases on which I've sort of been assigned to work and sort of bring them up to date about what things that are going on and whether or not there's any light at the tunnel. Don't ask me that question because I actually don't know.
yeah.
And yeah, that's sort of the state of this very strange prison. There
So
was a
who
lot
are
more
they?
activity. Oh, sorry.
Who are they?
Who are the detainees there right now? I don't know if I
Okay.
could rattle off all of their names. Most of them
But are they like
are.
terrorists, or accused of being a terrorist, or accused of being what?
I think they're all accused of being terrorists, right? Like that's the essence of Guantanamo is that an accusation was enough to give you essentially an indeterminate sentence in Guantanamo, um, by virtue of the government just accusing you of being a terrorist. The vast majority of those accusations turned out to be, if not wildly false, regularly false, or profoundly overstated. So all over the course of its decade and a half of existence, um, there have been about 800 men that have gone through Guantanamo. And there are only a dozen there now. And so if Guantanamo was, as it was advertised to be when it opened in January of 2002, to be the place to house the worst of the worst, that's we've let hundreds of the worst go, and that's true. That would have been true in the Bush administration, Obama administration, Trump administration, Biden administration. So I think that sort of belies a lot of the mythology around Guantanamo. The guys who are there now, the vast majority of them are in fact charged in the military commission, so the government certainly has much more evidence about their connections to Al Qaeda. Those among those are the people who, I think if you asked a majority of people would have thought the people should be in Guantanamo, who they would think should be in Guantanamo. If you presume that Guantanamo exists, who should it exist for? So some of those people are there, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the alleged mastermind of the September 11th attacks. But there are also, other folks, people like Abu Zubaydah, who was the very first person taken into the CIA's torture program. He was a Palestinian who I don't know the details of his case enough to speak confidently, but what I do know is that he was assumed to be a very high-ranking member of Al Qaeda, but in truth, he ran a guest house on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and was schizophrenic. And so, in some respects, you would say, well, that person actually does have a lot of intelligence value because they are literally at the gateway that most certainly foreign fighters, Arabs typically, would have gone through when they were going to Afghanistan in order to join Al Qaeda, fight with the Taliban in the
He has his
1990s.
own like Airbnb kind of thing.
It was basically an Airbnb, yeah, or a youth hostel would probably
Ah,
be a better sort of term for it. And so, on the one hand, you could say, "Hey, okay, that guy, he knows he can see who's coming and going. That's an important role, and that's someone who we'd want to get a lot of information out. Problem is, he also just wasn't actually at the center of the action, right? It's one thing to know who's going in and who's going out. It's another thing to know what Al Qaeda's plans are, and the guy who runs the Airbnb is typically not going to be the guy who knows who Al Qaeda's plans are, but because he was one of the few people in Al Qaeda who we knew about before and soon after September 11th, when they caught him, they just kind of assumed he knew everything. And so he was subjected to what can only be described as like human experimentation with torture. He was waterboarded like he was like 70 some times. Um, he was subjected to sort of all sorts of just improvised and I genuinely mean experimental approaches to try and get him to cough up information. And he, said certain things, like he told us, for example, who Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was, which we didn't know. And but he didn't do that under torture. He did that under interrogation by an FBI agent named Ali Soufan before he was put into the CIA's torture program. And when he was put into the CIA's torture program, the Senate did a report, that was released actually a decade ago, this past December, that found he nor anyone else actually gave any usable information. And when I say usable, I don't mean like usable in court. I mean information that we didn't already have from another source, including very often that person that was given sort of through ordinary interrogation or intelligence techniques, using ordinary intelligence techniques. And so we tortured all these people. We broke a pretty profound norm of international law, certainly compromised our reputation around the world in ways that I still don't think we've ever been able to overcome. And for nothing. So, it's a pretty dark story. And
I,
so,
I
so,
always feel,
and,
yeah,
and he's still in Guantanamo. And I'll just say this last thing, like the reason he's still in Guantanamo traces back to those, that experimental program back in 2002, because one of the things that some of the sort of individuals the CIA had hired to carry this out specifically asked for, and we know this because the Senate released at least part of these memos, was a guarantee that Abu Zubaydah would never see the light of day. And so he's been in Guantanamo ever since, or from about 2006 when they moved him there. Basically incommunicado with the outside world. You're not allowed to have visitors. Your family can't visit you, and that's because we tortured him and we don't know what to do with him.
I always feel like torture. I think we spoke about this before, but torture is like you never get anything because if I was tortured, I would just say whatever you wanted me to say.
Yep. Yeah.
No, I think the best thing is to watch someone else getting tortured and feel like this could happen to you. Then you're gonna say that information. But torture, I don't know like how much you're really going to give up. Maybe you give up some stuff, but then you give up everything that you just people want to hear. But I have so many questions about Guantanamo Bay because
Yeah,
hopefully
yeah.
never see it. But uh, is there women there?
Prisoners?
Yeah.
No, no, no. It's all been men. It's been about 800 men.
Okay. And how does it look like?
Guantanamo itself is a pretty, the Harold and Kumar sort of represented it very poorly, actually. It's not what, I mean, it's not like Jungle Island. It's this very arid, sort of scrubby desert island. And it is, in some parts, actually quite beautiful. Vast swaths of Guantanamo are essentially unspoiled or, minimally spoiled. Um, like scrub desert, and beaches. And one of the funny things that most people experience, certainly when they first go down to Guantanamo, is like they'll spend time in one of these prisons, doing all of these heavy lifting, you know heavy lifting jobs, certainly psychologically and emotionally, dealing with torture or something like that. And then you go to the beach, and you have a red stripe sitting on a Caribbean beach, and under the Caribbean sun, and it's a parts of Guantanamo are really genuinely quite beautiful. Um, Most of it is built up to sort of like military base specifications. And I don't know how many listeners of yours have ever been on to a real military base, but most military bases kind of look like small towns that have given very little thought to like architectural style.
Mm,
Right. So there's a Nex, which is basically a Walmart. There's a Starbucks. There's a gift shop. There's an ice cream, store. There's a bowling alley. There's a baseball field. There's a gym. There's a bar, like a pub bar. There's like a fancy restaurant. There's a fancy bar, right? Like those sorts of things. There's a tiki bar, because it is Guantanamo, and they try to keep things festive. Most of the people who work there
yeah.
are Jamaican and or Filipino, sort of guest laborers who come to Guantanamo and work on Guantanamo, and so you actually have a pretty thriving, um, like Jamaican and Filipino food scene that's kind of that's not entirely official, right? They're
Yeah.
these sort of like side barbecues, but they're fantastic. Um, and
Is it
and
like
yeah, yeah.
Zero Dark 30? Because I think they capture kind of like what you're saying a little bit.
It is, yeah. Is anyone who's ever been on like an actual sort of military base, even here in the United States, like some of the permanent ones, would recognize where they are, right? These are, like concrete buildings typically. They're I think they're yellow washed, right? So that they're the sort of they're not an attractive color. Like the architecture in Guantanamo is very despairing. Everywhere you look, most of the structures are in some way or another temporary, right?
Mm,
So things like trailers. Now these are high-end trailers, but these, it's mostly trailers that are kind of replaced on a 5 to 10 year cycle, depending on their quality and their size. Um, and the other thing, and this is probably one of the more surreal things about Guantanamo, but it sort of describes so much of it as a metaphor in some ways, is it's actually extremely cold to be there
mm,
because it's the military, and because there's a lot of like natural fauna that they don't want inside the buildings. Every building is air conditioned to like 60 degrees or less. So when you're inside, you are freezing. Like unless you are fully dressed, you are ice cold. But then you immediately go outside and it's 95 degrees. And so you're constantly going between these just like violent changes and extreme, like arbitrary changes in temperature that become, and so you develop a cold almost inevitably, just by virtue of all that. So it's this very artificial place, that is in a way clearly fighting its natural environment,
mm.
quite hard.
That's crazy. I don't know why. Do you think it's still usable? I mean, we definitely need a place like this too, because there is bad people in the world, and you need to, you know, have a place where, but do you think it was successful overall or not?
No, I think Guantanamo was a failure no matter how you measured it, and I'll point to two pieces of evidence for that. And I'm not saying that as a human rights lawyer, although I obviously think it's a human rights catastrophe. So I'm taking that as a given. But I think it's a failure for two profoundly obvious reasons, or there are two things that show you that how profound of a failure it was. The first is that, it was created as this response to September 11th, which was this massive crisis in this country, in terms of our, sense of security, what we thought, was possible. And Guantanamo itself is sort of built on this architecture of like, well, we're going to cut all the corners now. We're not going to follow our rules. We're not going to abide by the Geneva Conventions. We're not going to comply with the laws prohibiting torture. We're going to say the Constitution doesn't apply, even though it's essentially U.S. territory. And we're going to do all that so that we can bring the people who were responsible for September 11th to justice. And there is still not a trial in the September 11th case, even though the alleged mastermind of the September 11th attacks has been in Guantanamo since 2006. The most recent effort, and full disclosure, I assisted on an appeal in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals that remains pending on this issue, where the government, after 15 years of trying, 15, 16 years of trying to bring this case to trial, finally came to a plea deal with the 3 of the 4 or 5 alleged perpetrators of the September 11th attacks. And the big ask was that the death penalty is not imposed. That's literally the only thing the defendants get, is they've taken the death penalty off the table. In exchange for that, the government obviously gets the guilty plea. But because of the way the sentencing system in the military works, is they're actually still going to have essentially a full-blown trial where they get to put on all the evidence of how September 11th was planned, how it was perpetrated, and most importantly, the impact on the victims, right? Every victim, whether or not you are the son or daughter or parent or brother or sister of someone who died on September 11th, or were injured, if you were injured, if you were a firefighter, you will have an opportunity to do two things, one of which is completely extraordinary. The one that's ordinary is you'll get to testify, right? You'll get to have your, a day in court that has now been delayed by 25 years when it finally happens this September. And, I could never pretend to understand what that's like, but 25 years, my God. And so I think that is probably, I think that's a great thing about these plea deals. I think it's the only way this will ever end. And I think that alone is worth it. But the other thing, and this is completely extraordinary, actually, that was put into these plea deals is not only are the victims going to be allowed to testify in open court and to hear like the trial that they've been denied for the past 25 years, they're going to actually get the opportunity to pose direct questions to the perpetrators of the September 11th attacks. And a key term of the plea deal is that the perpetrators have to answer the questions honestly and completely, right? And that doesn't happen. That's just not part of any other court system in the United States. The closest thing I can compare it to is something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that they had in South Africa in the 1990s. And to me, that's just an extraordinary, again, I can't put myself in the shoes of these people, and I would never pretend to. I was in New York on September 11th, and I think everyone who feels very strong personal feelings, indeed feels victimized to a certain extent by that experience, completely justifiably. But to actually have lost someone you love, is unimaginable, especially that way, especially with everything else that has happened. But that ability to just confront the perpetrator, right, like face to face, and not only tell them what the consequences of their actions were to you, but to just ask them why. It's incredible. It's an incredible opportunity. And Lloyd Austin, on his way out the door in the Biden administration, I think probably for some kind of political purposes, it seems, because it was in the midst of the 2024 campaign, essentially reached down and in a very sort of irregular way attempted to put the plea deals, tried to pull the plea deals. It's not clear if that was legal. The military judge who has been presiding over the September 11th case for several years now ruled that it was illegal in November. The government appealed that decision to a military court that literally had never ruled against the government in its 20 years of existence. And it unanimously ruled that Secretary Austin could not disrupt this plea deal. That was on New Year's Eve of this past year. And then, literally right out the door, Austin pushed the government to take this case all the way up to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Extremely unusual, procedurally irregular in so many different ways that I won't even bore all your audience members with it. But this is full disclosure where I was given this case, and I argued this case back in January 28th. The argument in front of the D.C. Circuit lasted for 4 hours. I have never seen an oral argument in any court last for 4 hours, not even the Supreme Court. And um, I was up there for about an hour and a half, maybe, of that 4 hours. Most of it was, most of that time, the court was really just pushing the government on what a crazy situation this was. We still don't have a decision in that case. We could probably get it as soon as tomorrow, Friday, May 9th. Um, but I just have to, I just have to hope after all this time, after all this pain, after all of this waste, that the Court of Appeals will do exactly what all of the military judges who have looked at this case have said for the past now 9 months. Um, and that no, it's time. We have to just get this. This has to be done, and this is the only way it'll be done.
Do you feel the victims' families are for the plea or against the plea? Because in one way, like you said, we cannot be in their shoes at all and imagine what happened. A tiny bit, we were in New York at that day, and we know the anger that we have. So don't you want these people that did this to die? So if you take the
Yeah.
death penalty
I-
off, like that's one way. The other way, you want closure also, and you want to talk them and confront them and all that. So what do you think the overwhelmingly reaction of the victims' families?
it's diverse, and I don't blame anyone for having any opinion. I can't imagine what that's like. And so you have some people who just for I mean are just committed to never letting go of the principle that that the government should do everything it can to execute these guys, and that giving that up, cutting any deal is the equivalent of negotiating with terrorists. And you know what? I can't blame you if that's how you feel. I really can't, because I get it. A whole lot of the victims' families, there was actually a large group of them actually filed a brief in this case, that in that case that I argued back in January, represented, interestingly enough, by the former head of terrorism prosecutions in the Southern District of New York. The guy who probably would have prosecuted the September 11th case had the Obama administration followed through on transferring the 9/11 case to the Southern District of New York. A really just brilliant lawyer by the name of Nick Lewin. Um, very successful in several major terrorism prosecutions. Um, and he retired. He's in private practice now, and he wrote a brief on behalf of the families, on many of the families, not all of them, of course, but many of them, who said, who asked the court, look, stop jerking us around, right? Like, it's that simple. And I think, what they would say, or at least when I've talked to many of them, like, they're not looking for closure, because I don't think that's really possible. I don't know that it's ever possible when you have, like, a tragedy like that. But just given all that's happened, I don't think they could ever have closure. But some level of just like finality around this prosecution, right? Like, you might not be able to get closure, but finality is worth it all by itself, so that they don't have to constantly be
Hmm.
thinking about this trial, that they can live to see the end of it. Because there was one moment in the oral argument which where we were sort of talking about the way forward, and at one point the government said, if the court rules that these pleas can happen, the opportunity to revisit that decision, it won't be available probably for another 2 or 3 years. And I took that as an opportunity when I got up to just say, yes, if there is a decision that they need to undo these deals 2, 3 years from now, um, that's not to be ignored. But in the life of Guantanamo, 3 years isn't that long. And in fact, we sort of worked out, we just literally used like the calendar and worked out how long it would take um, for there to ever plausibly, like if things went fast, how fast it would take or how long it would take for the September 11th case to get sort of see to any of the defendants in the case to be executed, right? Like how long does it take in an ordinary case? What are all the procedural steps that have to happen? And we figured that out, and it would be 2050, right? 25 years from now, basically. And
You're
Khalid
already
Sheikh
dead.
Mohammed, right? He would be he'd almost 90 years old if he was still alive. And like what are we actually chasing when we say we have to seek the death penalty? And I just think there's no other way. I think the pursuit of the death penalty is an entirely abstract proposition in the September 11th case, and the best evidence for that, you don't have to take my word for it, and you shouldn't, um, is the prosecutors in this case, right? The prosecutors who have dedicated their entire careers in some cases to prosecuting and getting the death penalty against the perpetrators of 9/11, um, not only negotiated this deal and not only cut this deal, fully supported this deal and wrote like letters to within the government and to the victims' families saying that this is the only way to achieve finality. That given just the amount of complexity, the number of things that still have to be worked out, the number of opportunities that the defendants in these cases will have to challenge any conviction and certainly challenge any death sentence in the courts of appeals if that was ever even imposed. Given how long it will be until trial is even possible, maybe the end of the decade, but I think that's unlikely. Um, that this is the only answer to do it in our lifetimes, and because otherwise it's gonna peter out. Everyone's gonna die of natural causes, and you know, and we will have lost any opportunity for finality.
That's that's crazy. All right, let's switch gears to a lot of your expertise are human right and international law. And I feel with this world and everything is happening, and it's been happening, not just now, but is there any general respect for international law anymore or human rights if the victim is in the weaker side of country versus
Yeah.
stronger? Because it seems to me like, okay, human rights and international law are good if you are a strong country. You'll be like, hey, do this, but vice versa. What's your thoughts on that?
I don't know. It's hard because we're in a time when international law, I would say, for the past 25 years, has been under profound challenge. Some of that was for purely ideological reasons. The Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, I should say, came in with a lot of people. John Bolton is probably the most famous among them, who were just profound skeptics of international law and international institutions at all. Um, and so when 9/11 happened, it was perhaps not to be there's perhaps no reason to be surprised that the Bush administration decided that, we're not going to track international law. We're going to, at best, push to its outer boundaries. I believe the phrase at the time was to get chalk on their cleats when it came to the law. Um, and so that was a pretty profound challenge to international law. I do think, and I said this before, but I'll just repeat it. I do think that the um disdain and breach of the disdain for and the breach of the prohibitions against torture had a uniquely profound effect on the durability and integrity of international law. Like it's easy to forget, but like in the 90s, there was no debate about torture, right? Like if someone was being tortured in a movie, it was being done by either the communists, the Nazis, or the Japanese, right? Like that we didn't torture. And that was like that was part of our national story, and that was part of our, you know, that was one of the ways in which we attempted, really since the end of the Second World War, to demonstrate to the rest of the world, the weaker quote unquote nations of the world, that a global order built around international law, at which the United States was the center, was not just going to be the same colonial imperial, a new version of the same colonial imperial past that had led to the Second World War. Um, and the respect for individual human rights, which the prohibition on torture sort of uniquely embodies and protects, breaching that, I think, had a much more destabilizing effect on how people thought about the United States and how seriously people felt they had to take international law after that. And I think it's been pretty much downhill from there, right? Whether or not it's um, increasing aggression, across international borders, increasing disdain for norms against torture, certainly human rights norms. The I think the rise of a certain kind of, you know, illiberal nationalism that uses America's hypocrisy on things like torture and human rights as a very compelling argument in a lot of circumstances for why a different path that's built around ethno-nationalism
I feel like
is
also,
better. Yeah.
yeah, I feel like also like, maybe the victims should stop saying this is a human right violation and this is not according to international law because it really doesn't mean anything anymore. Uh,
Yeah,
you know,
I worry about that. I
yeah,
do. As someone, as so, yeah, I think, and then I think also, on the flip side, I think, and I'll criticize fellow human rights lawyers if you want, because I think that's a very fair criticism. Is I think on the flip side, there is a natural tendency to always ratchet rhetoric up to get more attention because the number of human rights violations every day is pretty staggering, um, and so human rights activists have a increasingly reached for the biggest guns in the human rights sort of vocabulary to address absolutely everything, which in turn diminishes everything as well.
yeah.
Um, and I think that's unfortunate too. I don't think human rights activists have been as strategic over the past
And
25
and
years
that's
as
the
they could
thing.
have been.
I don't think human rights or international law should be in play anymore, or should we use it? It just purely right and wrong. Like when you see the disasters in, like, say, Gaza or Sudan, or this is we don't have to say, oh, it's a human violation. No, it's not human violation. It's breaking the international law. Actually, no, it's not. Let's look at the law. It's right or wrong.
Yeah,
When the Holocaust happened, I've been thinking about this for a few days. When the Holocaust happened, we always, I always ever hear everybody saying, like, how could people live and let that happen? How can people be around and let shit like this happen? You know, Now we are hundreds of years more advanced in technology, and even the methods, like we see stuff more than was. I mean, the Holocaust is documented very well, and there's no question about everything that happened and how terrible it was. You see this happening again, and you see it, not only see it in TV. Have we become numb to these things because of the amount of, like you said, human rights violations that it's happening over and over and over? As long as it's not
yeah,
happening to us, then it's okay.
yeah. I think that's right, and I think I mean, like the world has always been a really just nasty, violent place. Like as a historian, especially, I can confirm that. And so I do think our media environment has certainly made people numb in a way to these issues, and in a way that's really counterproductive. But I agree with you too that I think the resort to legal rhetoric in these situations um, is is lazy. Um,
Okay.
so like no, but I think your basic point about the immediate and constant and almost incessant resort to legalistic language in talking about these international humanitarian catastrophes is really counterproductive and stupid. And if you look at George Orwell's Politics in the English Language, what he's talking about transcends ideology. What he's saying is that, look, when you use euphemisms, when you use technical language, you deprive people of the ability to think clearly about things. And law, by design, is all just jargon and technical language that prevents people from thinking clearly about things. And so, when speaking about, humanitarian catastrophes, particularly in places like Sudan, right? Like it is genocide. Like actually, that's a legal matter. Yes, it's 100% genocide. And there are very earnest, incredibly capable prosecutors. And that matters, I should say, and that matters because there are incredibly able, diligent prosecutors at something called the International Criminal Court in The Hague who are actively investigating and seeking the arrest of the people perpetrating that genocide. They want to hold them accountable. And so I think it's entirely appropriate to call it genocide generally, um, and important for the people who are conducting those prosecutions and those investigations to use legal language and to think about it in a very deliberate, specific way. Um, but I also think when you hear those kinds of words, like it's not, it's at the end of the day, they are just legal jargon. And instead of saying, genocide, say some, this armed group called the SDF, in just recently raided just a couple of weeks ago, raided a refugee camp called the Zamzam camp, um, where there are approximately 1 million refugees, and maybe more than that. Already about 300,000 of them have fled the refugee camp, right? These are literally refugees fleeing a refugee camp, because the SDF forces, or the Special Defense Forces, I think what they're called, um, were going house to house, shooting people dead, raping women, stabbing people to death. There are literally hundreds of people who've been killed in the most violent ways you can imagine. They bombed. They used military weapons, um, against this camp over the past, month, essentially, less than a month. And I think talking about it in those plain terms, that you have a humanitarian crisis involving hundreds of thousands of people fleeing for their lives with nothing, and because essentially an armed gang is going house to house in a refugee camp, murdering people, murdering families. Like, to me, I think that's a much more relevant way of talking about these things than simply saying there's a genocide in Sudan. Even though,
Yeah.
as a lawyer, I think it's very important to say there is a genocide in
Yeah.
Sudan.
I feel also like it's easier in a way to say, okay, it's a crime, it's genocide when it's one group of people doing it to their own people. But like
Mm,
the situation in Gaza, it's harder. And you see debates for days and months and years now about genocide or not genocide, while 2 million Palestinians are dying, Like, okay, let's not okay, do whatever you want to do and call it whatever, but it's a crime. There's something happening there. October 7th, same thing with the October 7th, attack. So, when Hamas was doing it to the Palestinian people itself, it was okay. But then when they did to Israeli, it wasn't. But I feel like there's so much when you talk about, human rights and people, like you said, try to get into the legal terms. Well, let's get an expert about genocide. Is Gaza genocide or not genocide? Well, technically they were no, there's a crime. It's like you say, there's innocent people. How many civilians are dying? How is that? And and to me also is like, what's the target? Like, what is it that the Israeli government has accomplished? Okay,
mm,
you killed some leadership, great. I think the number one thing is protect your own. And why don't you go after Qatar or the other where the real leaders are?
mm.
So I feel like a lot of, like you said, it's important to have human rights lawyers and terms and stuff like that, but also it's important that we don't get lost in the, debate.
Terminology. Yeah,
Yeah,
just
and say
the
like,
word
okay,
salad. Yeah, for sure.
but I think, what's funny to me is like,
Like, unless you're a lawyer, you should talk about genocide, but that's not your concern, because like it's not, part of your job. If you're working the International Criminal Court, talk about genocide all the time. It's an important problem.
yeah,
It's an important
and
part of
and
your
and
job.
what's
But if you're a normal person, just like say what it is. Like,
What's
just
funny
look
to me
at it.
is like when you say like, okay, the Gaza debate is like, is it genocide or not genocide? Isn't it bad enough that we're questioning if it's genocide or not genocide? Like you just worry about that word, but isn't it?
Right, and I, not even specific to Gaza or to Yemen or Sudan or Ukraine or any other of the parts in the world now that are in extreme undergoing extreme violence. Um, I think just for most people, again, unless you're working in the International Criminal Court, these legalistic questions are kind of irrelevant to you, and you shouldn't worry about them. And what you should really worry about is what you're seeing, like, and think about it in as plain of a way as you can, because if you get bogged down, or you allow yourself to get bogged down in these hyper legalistic debates, I can tell you this: I'm a really, I'm a lawyer. I can make an argument on any side of an issue,
Yeah.
right? And because that's the nature of law. It's a kind of word play at at its worst. And if you're concerned genuinely about the suffering of people who
Exactly.
are in war, um, like that just don't get into the why are you playing word games? Like
Yeah.
relieve their suffering. Like think of be clear about what you care about and focus on that as opposed
And
to
and
getting
it's
into
always,
these
yeah.
idiotic debates, frankly.
And that's the thing.
Yeah.
The Gaza specifically one is interested to this conversation because when Hamas was doing it to their own people, nobody cared. You know,
Right. They were a terror state,
yeah,
right? Like if
they
you
were doing it to their own
yeah.
people. No one cared. But once now Israel's doing it, and they should care in both. That's wrong and that's wrong. That's just as wrong. But I'm saying it was okay to like now we're saying Hamas is terrorist organization. We always said that. They've been doing this for years in the Middle East. But they end up and when you have like but again, atrocities like in Sudan that, it's not really a media
Right.
like,
It's not yeah, I have to say this as particularly as a Columbia University professor, and I don't begrudge students like their earnest desire to make the world a better place. I think a lot of it can be very yeah, I mean a bit overwrought because they're students, they're young people, and if they weren't overexcited about everything, they wouldn't be young and it would be sad because it would be depressing, right? Like kids are supposed to go way out over their skis. That's how they learn. Um, but I do think as someone who has been in the space for an extremely long period of time, the amount of political energy that gets thrown into the Israel-Gaza conflict um, is so difficult to frankly understand when you look at humanitarian crises in places like Ukraine or Sudan or Yemen that have been going on for an
or
extremely long period
Congo
of time.
or so many.
Yeah, right. That Congo's gotten a little better, but still, like it's like these are active humanitarian crises that where the number of people suffering and dying are, it's not a numbers game, but orders of magnitude greater in far more horrible ways in many
Yeah. I
instances.
mean, I mean,
Which is not, it's not an Olympics. Like you can't compare
yeah.
suffering,
No,
but I do think there is a certain amount of like selectivity in the kinds of issues that people seem to get motivated about. And I worry, in my cynical moments, I worry that it's because, you know, for one reason or another, maybe racism in a very subtle way, like Yemenis and Sudanese just aren't as photogenic to
yeah.
the kinds of people who feel motivated and to be active. And I think those crises, warrant enormous amounts of attention that they're not getting. And I worry that a lot of the energy that gets invested um, in others does very much come at the cost of real attention to these humanitarian crises that have
Yeah,
mattered a lot.
I'm conflicted about this because there's two sides to it. I think one, obviously there's you don't can compare pain or number or anything, and if you react to one uh human disaster happening, you have to react the same to the other. But on also, that's one side of it. But the other side, you can feel more when you are from that part of the world.
Sure. Oh yeah, yeah. I
A
don't.
lot of the Colombia maybe and why you're like there's happened a lot of Middle Eastern, a lot of people that know people. So in one way. And the other thing is like the other argument I always hear, when people say like, oh, look at these dumb college students. They don't even know what's going on. Ask any of them what's going on. They don't know the history. It doesn't matter. They don't need to. They reacting human to human. They see somebody and they're young and energetic and stuff like they should know more. But if you see amount of babies dying or like in Ukraine, like there's no more like they kidnapping men now to like fucking go to like your reaction to it is a human reaction. So it's okay if you don't know. Don't make
Yeah.
an
No. I.
argument and don't go and debate, but you can react to it in a certain way.
Oh yeah. And again, I don't begrudge the they're students. This is exactly what college students can and should be doing. I don't think they should be taking over the library like they did yesterday.
Yeah.
I don't think that I I don't know one person in Gaza who was like, oh, thank goodness they've closed room 310 at Butler,
Yeah.
right? Um, and was like, "Oh, thank God, we've been saved by that." I don't mean to be glib about it, but I
Yeah.
think there are, there are relationships between means and ends, and that the desire to do something should be directed at things that are fundamentally constructive as opposed to destructive. And I know I sound like a old fuddy-duddy, and maybe I am when I say that, but I do, as someone who cares about these issues a lot, I also do, as much as I can be an old fuddy-duddy, I do care about these issues an awful lot, and I do think these kids, by and large, probably not all, but some, most, are have their hearts in the right place and care deeply. Whether or not they are, advocating for, a much greater respect than I think was given to the October 7th, right, to the suffering of Israelis on October 7th, um, or to the sort of the plight of the Palestinian people, which has been, ongoing in places like Gaza, has been grinding for decades. And so, I don't, I'm not begrudging anybody their earnest beliefs and desires to want to see the world have less suffering or make it or be a better place. I have dedicated my career to doing that, but I do also think there is a certain amount of, I always worry about the radical chic.
Yeah.
Um, and that's something to at least keep
I,
an eye, to be
even
honest,
if you
with
look,
ourselves.
yeah,
Yeah.
if you look at the history of like protests and stuff like that, the peaceful one is the one that gets results, Like instead of like blocking the highway, organize the highway, be in the side. Like if you give people a reason to look at your cause, that's the whole thing. Like you said, taking over a library, like what is that mean? First of all, you're gonna have you're gonna make pe some people be afraid. There's obviously the rise of anti-Semitism, in schools and stuff like that. Some Jew and
Yeah.
it's interesting because when the protest first happened, there was more Jewish students that protesting. So why don't you want them in your side? Why would you block? It's crazy to me. So
Yeah,
uh
I don't know the demographic breakdown of the students who are protesting. And again, students protest, that's what they do. I thought Columbia was mishandled this profoundly last year when this all happened, in several different ways. But I also think, you know, I do think it's a part of the maturing process is to understand that the like that performance art, so to speak, has a place,
yeah,
but is not always, but it is not an end in itself.
yeah,
And I think what certainly one of the dangers of activism, and that anyone who's an activist falls into, um, is that the protest becomes the purpose as opposed to using protest to achieve practical goals. And as you said, the great nonviolent protests of the 20th century, whether or not it was India, or in the United States in the context of the civil rights movement, like those were protests, and they got attention, but they got attention not for the sake of attention. And the protests that sought attention for the purpose of attention, very often sort of burned themselves out. And so I do think just being more, again, it's not as glamorous,
yeah.
um, but I think the hard work of trying to figure out practical ways of making people's lives better is something that I don't think it's unreasonable to say students should think about doing that,
Yeah.
as
I
opposed
think
to
the
taking over a library.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, they have a lot of energy, and you react to, for us, in a way, being older, you get numb to like you saw so many things. They're still young, and this is their first, you
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was there
know,
too. I was a kid once.
yeah,
It
so
was great. Yeah.
you're gonna get so frustrated, and they wanna get and they so angry at the world for letting this happen. So they wanna reflect on a way. And obviously, if they have leaders, that can somebody like you, somebody that's why I'm saying like it's important to the government to direct them. But that's a good advice that you said. And also, I feel like if you say like, okay, what can I do to help people in Gaza, for example, or in Sudan or in Yemen, whatever um, you feel like this is your cause or belong to. You know, uh, it's exactly what you said. How can I make their life better today, the kid of Gaza? First, I want to bring attention to the situation, and I'll bring more ally. not get people say like, why are you blocking the highway, or why are you, get more aligned and stuff like that. But so from Colombia perspective, what's your thoughts on this whole thing and defunding of major schools of the Colombia, whatever you can
It's
talk.
been no, it's been really disruptive. I think it's one of it's disruptive in a couple of ways that I think are really dangerous and in the short term, not just the long term. Um, the biggest is that it has almost by design forced people to self-censor in ways that I don't think is healthy in a university. I don't think it's healthy when conservative students get shouted down or conservative speakers get shouted down and don't feel as if they can express themselves on campus. Um, and I don't think it's good to have the government using the sort of the strings of research funding from the NIH, National Institutes of Health, or the National Endowment for the Arts, or the National Science Foundation, which has been integral to our economy and to the reason why we not only have probably the most productive economy in the world, but the envy of the world when it comes to universities, right? People come to our universities from all over the world because they are the best universities in the world, and that's not an accident. It's because we have invested since the 1940s in making our universities the hub of innovation and the center of the growth of knowledge in so many different fields. It would take me an hour just to iterate through everything from, the creation of the internet all the way through gene editing, through, you name it, right? All of our universities is where the major breakthroughs of the 20th century have largely come. And the idea that we are um, sort of using that the idea that the government would use that as leverage to create a kind of orthodoxy, right wing or left wing, is, I think, profoundly dangerous because it prevents universities from doing what they do, which is to be a place where you can have the free exchange of ideas. I don't think they've succeeded in that for a variety of reasons for the past few decades, but I don't think sort of and that's free of ideology. I'll just say that much.
Yeah.
Um, and in the short term, I think it's made it a very hostile place for people who you want to be applying their creative genius to finding the next cure for cancer, to use a cliche, to be. And you're making it harder for them to do that. You're really discouraging um, the role the universities have played as a beacon to the world to get students and the smartest people, not just students, but professors,
Yeah.
the smartest, best professors from all around the world, to come to the United States to do their research. If you're cutting off funding and sort of taking a much more hostile approach to academic freedom as well as the immigration laws, and so I think that's just in the very short term, that's extremely dangerous in terms of debilitating our ability to maintain our economic and intellectual advantage as a country.
I
And in the longer term, it's hard to know what the consequences will be, but none of them will be good because we're going to have less innovation. We're going to
yeah.
have, less, fewer advances in the areas that we claim to care about the most, which is health, artificial intelligence, or physics. That's our universities are the pipeline, if both for that research and the people who do that research. And if we kill that golden goose, the long-term consequences to our country are going to be, unfathomable and all to the negative.
Just like I was saying, we are almost numb with all the human atrocities that's happening. We also, one of the things that makes the United States the best country in the world is, like I said, the innovation and stuff. One of the things that I think is like we invented too much that we still don't get enough credit for is like the vaccine. We got the vaccine in 7 months. Like,
Right. And we could have released it faster. There was the seven
yeah.
months was all regulatory.
And
So
it's insane. But and also the other side to your point is like, again, just like protest, when you study history, Europe and Germany specifically were more advanced in science. And the major point was when Hitler started what he started doing, all the German, specifically Jewish scientists moved to the United States.
Yeah.
And that was how it started shifting the achievement, even the atomic bomb, all this, a lot of the accomplishments happened from European moving to the United States, so specifically, as I said, Jewish scientists going here, coming here and innovating. So if this continue happening and the best afraid to go to the universities here,
Yeah.
this shift is going to happen again, you know?
Yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, whether or not it was Albert Einstein, Arthur Teller, John von Neumann, right? If you look at the major
Yeah.
luminaries of the sort of mid 20th century innovations and revolutions in physics, and particularly atomic physics, as well as computer science,
Yeah.
almost all of those scientists were
And,
refugees
and not
from.
only that, yeah, and not only that, they became teachers. They taught a lot in schools, which then the next generation. I don't understand. If you were Hitler, wouldn't you say like I hate Jews, but hey, Einstein, not you. Come on, silly.
Well, but again, this is what happens when you allow ideology to, blind you in from your just practical approach to the world.
Yeah,
Because, Hitler developed the Nazis had these very, let's just say, exotic, almost hippy dippy theories of health and science, that are kind of new agey actually, and he thought like quantum mechanics and physics, like the essentially the building blocks of atomic science that led to the atomic bomb, that was quote unquote Jewish science,
yeah,
and because it didn't align with this pre-existing worldview. They had some of the major atomic scientists, even after
yeah,
all of the refugees left, and many of those refugees too were not even themselves Jewish. They might have had a Jewish relative or a Jewish wife. Arthur Teller, for example, was not Jewish himself, no, so Enrico Fermi, who was an Italian, but he had a Jewish wife, and so he fled Italy
yeah.
to the United States and ended up working
No,
on
the
the
point I
atomic.
was trying to make
Yeah,
exactly
yeah,
the point is like it doesn't have to be specific, but once you stop immigration, because when people say like, oh, we're not gonna have a close effect. Well, the Second World War, they both were working in an atomic
yeah.
bomb. Both were, and they were both were weeks away.
Yeah,
And
yeah. They had a Heisenberg. Heisenberg was probably the preeminent physicist, preeminent atomic physicist in the world,
yeah,
in the 1940s, and the Germans had him heading up their atomic program, and they made a lot of progress, right? They
yeah.
they literally did have the firepower to get it
I,
done.
I mean, one of the
Yeah.
last speeches that Hitler had that the secret weapon, you remember that? He said that he have a
Oh
secret
yeah.
weapon that was almost, and that was it. So, and it's funny, this is how dumb I am. When you said Heisenberg, I said from Breaking Bad. Uh, but yeah. Michelle, always great to have you. Always great conversation. What are you working on right now? Any book coming up? What's happening?
Yeah, I am. It's still in the early phases, but I've been thinking a lot about the end of the Vietnam War and that transition in American life and politics. And so my next book is probably going to be about that. Um, so keep an eye out for it. But in the meantime, with Father's Day coming up, my biography of Dwight Eisenhower, The Light of Battle, is a book mostly about D-Day, but it's a broader biography of Eisenhower and his thought. And makes a great gift for dad. It has football, father-son issues. Winston Churchill and Patton are big characters in the book. So basically, anything you could want in a dad book you will find in the Light of Battle.
Yeah, and I'll leave the link in the description here so you can just click it and view, go and get it for your dad. Michelle, thank you so much. As usual, amazing conversation. Appreciate it. Live from
Yeah,
America.
yeah. Thanks, man. It was great talking.
And no, Noam. See, we talk more.
That's right.
Have a good one.